So welcome everyone to this webinar offered by the Canadian Interfaith Conversation, where we will be talking about hope and solidarity in a time of COVID-19. Um, my name is Jeff Cameron, and I serve as Director of Public Affairs for the Bahá'í Community of Canada. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Peter Noteboom and Rabbi Dr. Laura Duhan-Kaplan. And we'll be exploring how religious communities are feeling the effects of coronavirus and what they're doing to contribute to resilience and solidarity at this time. So I wonder, Laura and Peter, if you wouldn't mind just briefly introducing yourselves before we start the conversation. Laura, would you please go first?
Sure. I'm Rabbi Laura Duhan-Kaplan, and I work as Director of Interreligious Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology, which is an ecumenical Christian seminary located on the campus of University of British Columbia, with programs in Indigenous studies and interreligious studies. And I am the only Jewish faculty member, so I enjoy the challenges and blessings of an interreligious environment every day.
Thanks, Laura. Peter, what about you?
Yeah, so thank you. I work as the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. And the Canadian Council of Churches is really a Christian unity and peace organization. That's our main purpose. We also say that we seek Christ's truth with an affection for diversity, and that we act together in love through prayer, dialogue, and witness to the gospel. So that it's my privilege to serve as General Secretary there. And I've also recently been appointed or asked to serve as the co-chair of the Canadian Interfaith Conversation. I'm very much looking forward to learning about what that role will be like.
Wonderful. Well, thanks both of you for joining us today. Peter, I'd like to start with you with this conversation. You helped to coordinate an interfaith statement called Hope, Gratitude, and Solidarity that was signed by dozens of religious leaders and endorsed by the Canadian Interfaith Conversation. Could you talk a little about the motivation for creating a statement like this and why you think it's important for religion to speak with one voice at a time like the one we're living through right now?
Thank you. That's such a good question. You know, the first thing I thought of is that actually there's a pre-existing desire among the participants in the Canadian Interfaith Conversation and many religious communities to act together. In the Canadian Interfaith Conversation, we have 10 years of relationships, 10 years of learning from one another, 10 years of working together on some shared projects. And so there is this, through the friendships and the mutual respect that we've developed over the years, I think we've had a pre-existing desire to speak together at a time like this. And so when I first got word of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Canadian Rabbinic Caucus proposing a statement that would be for religious leaders in the context of COVID-19, it just appeared natural to me that we could call up our friends and say, let's do this together. Let's work through the text and what we'd like to say. Let's draw on our expertise from our various religious communities to try to sharpen what we can say together. And so it felt in a way natural. It didn't feel forced. It felt like it was the fruit of many years of cooperation and collaboration already.
Thank you. Now, Laura, as you mentioned, you're the Director of Interreligious Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology. What Peter was just describing was an interreligious approach to thinking about the contribution of religion to public thinking at the time of coronavirus. Could you say something about how taking an interreligious approach to this crisis gives us added perspective, the way in which our thinking can be enriched by looking at what different traditions have to offer?
For sure. And I'll say two things. One, really building on what Peter said, which is that each tradition has a tremendous history and storehouse of spiritual and psychological support resources. We each speak a slightly different language, but we have perhaps each a piece of the puzzle for hope and inspiration and support. Some traditions connect us with a sense of unity of all being that runs through all life, and other traditions focuses on connecting with a specific figure that provides us with support and guidance. And when we start to open the door to learn from one another, we get a greater inner set of resources that we can draw on. So that's one piece. The other piece is that it's hard to run a religious organization. It's very time consuming. And it's very time consuming to be a member of a small religious community, even in one faith tradition. And so we don't usually spend a lot of time investigating the ideas and tools and teachings of the different traditions. And yet, when something like a crisis brings us together, it opens the doors for the relationships that will allow us to continue learning from one another.
Thank you, Laura. Peter, I wanted to just come back to you, just thinking about some of Laura's comments. Maybe you could summarize what are some of the key insights that came out of bringing together this statement on hope, solidarity, and gratitude. Is there thinking about the way that these different traditions can produce a kind of shared understanding? Were there some aspects of that statement you'd like to highlight for us?
You know, what I thought the statement did and does quite well is that it really draws on a wealth of different perspectives in a natural way. And so when it speaks about hope, it acknowledges that that hope can come from different places. It can come from love of our families and love of our communities. It can come from our love for our work and our vocation and our calling. It can come from the stories of our religious traditions. It can come from the shared experience of working out those religious convictions in communities of faith. So I feel that the statement was nicely drafted in a way that accomplished that, not in a forced way, but in a natural way, when speaking about hope. And then when speaking about gratitude, that actually comes naturally. The language of blessing, the language of gratitude, I think that's so strongly shared in our various religious traditions that really comes easily. And I think maybe one of the gifts of many years of working together, and one of the gifts of working together in Canada as faith communities, is that we've developed a practice of listening first to those who are affected the most, of paying attention and being alert to the lived experience of the poor, of the marginalized, of people who live far from healthcare facilities or don't have easy access to them, or who might be affected in a different way or in a more difficult way than others. That doesn't come naturally, but we have a practice and a tradition of doing that that shows up again in this document on hope, gratitude, and solidarity.
Thank you. Now, Laura, you're based in Vancouver, and I know you're connected to a number of communities on the West Coast. And I wonder if you could share what you've seen from the experience of religious communities responding to this crisis. How have you seen on the ground the reaction, the response animated by the beliefs and principles of religion?
Well, I've seen some things both within individual communities and across communities as they begin to come together. Within individual communities, I have seen that we are all a lot better at conflict resolution than we might have thought we were. Often within small religious communities, there are dozens of committees and dozens of conflicting opinions, and it takes many weeks or months of process to answer a question and decide how to go forward. Yet, when an emergency presented itself, and for reasons of health and safety, communities had to make decisions about how they were going to come together safely. They made those decisions in a week, in 2 weeks, and came together with a clarity and a focus that, based on my conversations with friends and colleagues, a clarity and a focus that surprised even them. In terms of communities coming together, the crisis has provided some opportunities for communities to come together that are completely new. There are many communities that have interfaith outreach and collaboration as part of their program, and there are many communities that don't have the time and the bandwidth to do that. Yet, together with several colleagues here in British Columbia, we compiled a list early on in the crisis. We compiled a list of all of the religious communities of all traditions that we could find in British Columbia. And we gave that to the Ministry of Health. And they convened 2 conference calls, one of which I was privileged to be on. 130 leaders, both professional and volunteer, from religious communities of all kinds came together on that call. And one of the things we heard during the questions and conversation was that every community was most focused on how to continue its work supporting those having the most difficult time in the crisis. So, for example, the Jewish community wanted to know how to continue to make its food bank available to people. The Sikh community wanted to know how best to safely consider feeding the hungry through their langar meals. The women's organization within the Church of Latter-day Saints wanted to know how they could best continue their work of visiting and supporting people in isolation. And hearing this affirmed in one space and one time really, really reminded us how much we are all united in the kind of work of social justice and social support that Peter was talking about.
Thank you. Just to pick up on that last point, Peter, there are many people will recognize the role of religion and spirituality in helping people to get through a crisis at a personal level, whether this be through prayer or meditation or personal faith. These are powerful reservoirs of resilience for people. But religion also has this role to play in how we think about society in many of the ways that Laura has just touched on. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to this. Just how does faith and religion influence our approach to social questions in the context of this crisis, whether it relates to questions of justice, how we treat vulnerable populations, or even how we understand ourselves at this moment in history when we're rethinking many foundational questions about what kind of society we want to be.
It's such a good question, and I'm struck even in the way you ask it about how you're naturally using the plural form. How will we do it? I think frequently people see religion as something personal, something private, something you work out on your own. But it's true that faith is personal and that it is about one's deepest convictions and it is about personal and spiritual practices. But faith and religion is really a communal enterprise. It's really a community project. And so when people work out their faith together with other people, then those faith communities also have practices for how they do their work. And when I think about that question, how how does faith and religion influence our approach to the questions? I think the first thing that comes to mind is humility. In the face of the divine, um, or in the experience of the divine, or in touch with the possibility of a divine, then to me anyway, the first response to that is humility. It isn't one of pride and of certainty and of knowing, but one of humility. I think I mentioned before too then that gratitude and blessing are natural languages for faith communities, and I think that that's another important language, ways that faith communities approach social questions. I think I also mentioned, that good fortune we have in Canada of a tradition of listening to those who are more experiencing the lived experience of discrimination or of scarcity of one kind or another. And I think that alertness is something I've learned a great deal about from other faith communities. And I think it's a kind of underappreciated religious value or spiritual practice of being alert to what's going on and what's happening around us. And when faith communities do their work well, they are alert. Um, I think another thing that often comes up, at least I experience it in the work that I do, which often is about bringing different faith communities to speak together or act together on something, is that there's an overriding concern for inclusion. How will we include everyone? How will we strike some balance? How will there be harmony in what we want to say in the way that it lives out our values? So that comes through usually very strongly. Um, but really, I guess it's about that reflection of testing out our deepest values and our deepest convictions, and not doing that on our own, but with others in community. And so I think that bringing our deepest values and deepest convictions to bear on a particular context or the particular challenge with others is a gift that, dare I say, few other communities in society offer.
Please
Yeah,
continue, Laura. Yeah.
Jeff, your questions are so excellent that I find myself wanting to answer all of them. So perhaps I could continue on a couple of the
Please.
themes that Peter highlighted in his answer. I want to echo the idea of gratitude. And I read it so beautifully stated in a Benedictine text a few years ago that gratitude establishes our relationship with God because it helps take us out of the funk that we are in when we turn our attention to the things in our lives that we can be grateful for. And when we get a little bit out of being sunk into ourselves, we begin connecting with something larger than ourselves, something right that transcends that moment and begins to connect us with a larger feeling of the transcendent. And in religious communities, we practice gratitude, blessing, and feeling into that transcendence, right, in a way that makes life more meaningful, more bearable, and often more joyful. In 2017, the Angus Reid Foundation partnered with the Cardis Foundation to study Canadians' experiences, perceptions, and attitudes around religion and public life. And one of the things that they found in their research was that the 30% of Canadians who are religiously committed, that is, participate regularly in spiritual communities, this 30% report themselves happier on indexes of happiness, more engaged with their communities and the larger community as volunteers, and also that they are much more likely to say that having care and concern for others is a fundamental life value and that doing it makes your life better. And we practice that particular value of caring for one another both within communities for the members of our communities, and also as each community does outreach into the larger community. And it's really notable that people report that caring for others makes them happier. And I think that religious communities could do a much better job of exporting that value throughout our society.
In the Baha'i community, we often talk about having a twofold moral purpose. That on the one hand, one of our purposes in life is to improve our own character, but that's also related to our contributions to the community around us, the extent to which we are serving our community. And these two things, one can't necessarily be done without the other. There's a relationship between our own personal spirituality and our own active concern with contributing to the common good. And that's something I heard come out in both of your comments. But maybe we can take the reflection you were just on, Laura, a little bit further. Because one thing I've been noticing in a lot of the public conversation around our response to coronavirus is a kind of rejection of individualism and selfish action. These are sometimes qualities that are praised and even tolerated in our society, but it seems that there has been a kind of mobilization around working together. There's this phrase, "we're all in this together," that I think has become a sort of mantra of our response to this pandemic. So maybe if I could ask you to speculate or think ahead a little bit, what potential do you think is there that we can come out of this time with a different attitude towards solidarity, unity, and collective action?
Peter, do you want to go first?
No, please. I love to listen to you.
I think that people of all faiths and people of no faith are, even in the short 6 weeks so far that we've been very serious about physical distancing, I think in these 6 short weeks, people are really coming to understand what is most important to them. Shopping is not that important as a recreation. I understand that people shopping less does have a big impact on other people's livelihoods, and I don't want to minimize that. But some of the things that were more material based and shorter term satisfaction based that we spent a lot of time doing, we're really seeing are not as important to us. The most important things to us are keeping alive the connections with family and friends, coming together for spiritual support. I'm a member of 2 synagogues, and both of the synagogues are having much greater remote participation than they typically have in-person participation, because people are really realizing how important spiritual support is to them. We're also coming to see that artistic creativity is important. People are taking up the arts and posting their beginner efforts online for all of their friends to see. So I'm hoping that one of the things we take away is a desire to spend more time, right, developing interpersonal relationships, deeper parts of ourselves, and our personal creativity. And I will add that as I see the world, creativity also opens us up onto our imagination, which means we are a lot more primed to enter into those hopeful spaces Peter was talking about, and that you are hinting at in all your questions, Jeff, those spaces where we can really envision things being different and better.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll echo again many of your themes. I think we're weaving through each other nicely. Um, just to say a bit more about time, um, we're on virus time, not human time. We're on Mother Earth time or Creator time, which is a little different. It sets us up for realizing that we're not in control. And I think it holds the potential for us to emerge a bit more humble, a little more aware of our place in creation, our place in the cosmos, maybe a little more aware of our own vulnerability, maybe a little less prideful, maybe a little less certain, maybe a little more curious. I think there's potential for that. Um, I think a crisis like this also shines a light on those areas where things were a problem before, but we were content to scan over them or gloss over them, whether it's care for the elderly or care for those suffering from domestic abuse or care for migrants or other parts of Canadian society where folks were having a difficult time, but we were used to walking past them. It's now clear that they're there, and we're more aware, and hopefully we can be more alert to those things. And I guess the other is that if we um, have more experience of banging pots and pans together, of being on Zoom calls together, of doing other things that express our sense of being in it together, that we might be able to sustain that, and maybe we could also apply it to some other challenges that maybe aren't so short term and focused the way this one is, or who knows if it'll be short or medium or long term, but um, as intense, let's say, as this one is. But others that have been around for a while and are as great, whether it's nuclear, the threat of nuclear annihilation or the use of nuclear weapons, whether it's the change in ocean and climate change, whether it's the scale of inequality or prejudice or discrimination. Hopefully, we can use what we learn this way and also apply it in these other areas that are longer term crises.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just to echo, may
please
I?
do. Yeah.
Just to echo and extend one of Peter's themes again, I think that a pandemic also shows us how biologically connected we are. And we can't ignore some of the people and the problems that in a safer time, it might be easier to push to the margins of our thought and our visibility. For example, if the virus runs in a homeless encampment, then the virus is going to run through the city. It's not a separate strata of existence that those with money and policy expertise can ignore, because what happens to the least of us now happens to all of us.
Yeah, it seems like there is something about a pandemic and a virus that exposes a reality that was always there, in the sense that it's always been the case that we have been interdependent, that our own individual actions have some impact on people who we may not even know in the world around us, whether this be through our economic choices in our lives or our personal actions when we're in public or our professional actions. These are never really private things. They all in some ways influence those around us. But there's something about a virus that is a kind of signifier or symbol of this reality, which, as you say, is that we are biologically interconnected and therefore also interdependent. And perhaps this can give rise to a greater consciousness at some level of our, you might say, our fundamental oneness, our shared humanity, our interdependence. Um, and that might influence the way in which we look at problems in the future. So I wonder before we end this conversation, perhaps you might each share what are your own hopes and aspirations for how we can start with Canadian society, but we can even extend our vision to all of humanity. How could things be different coming out of this? You know, a moment of crisis is a time for reflection. It's a time in a way when things end at some level and new beginnings can come forward as well. So, you know, to the extent that this may be a turning point for our society and for humanity, how might we hope things could be different? So that's a big question, not a small one. I'd like to invite either of you to share your maybe your closing reflections on what we might hope the future could look like as we emerge from this crisis.
I'll start. I'm a dual citizen of Canada and the United States. So here I am on the 49th parallel with half my attention in one direction and half my attention in another direction. And I am seeing that in the United States, despite the strong efforts of many politically activated, motivated, caring, dedicated people, to some extent, the virus is being used as an opportunity to further divide people, to blame different groups for their role in introducing the virus or perpetuating the virus. People are literally protesting against one another's existence, and it's very heartbreaking to watch. And when I look at the rhetoric and much of the action across Canada, the opposite is the case. There is so much talk at every level of our society about putting aside differences and focusing on what we have in common and working together. On the call with religious leaders, our Premier of BC, John Horgan, laughed a little bit and said, "You all know that I don't see eye to eye politically or necessarily personally with the premiers of the other provinces, but because of us focusing together on the emergency and sharing information, we are actually becoming friends." And that is a different approach to politics than we have seen in Canada before. And I am hoping that when the emergency fades, what will stay with us is, right, the sense that we are all in this together, the friendships that we have created, the new knowledge we have about how much each tradition has in common, how different parts of society are connected, and that our motivations for living together will, will evolve to something kinder and gentler and calmer, to paraphrase our provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry.
Thank you. And Peter.
You know, when you ask the question, just to model what we're talking about, I think it's religious symbols that come to mind for me first. Um, One of my favorite phrases comes from the book of Revelations, and I'm not even sure what it was meant to say, but it has lived in my imagination for many years, which is that, "Behold, I am making all things new." Um, and when I think about what that means, to be renewed, to be the renewal of all, I think about a place for each and all. I think about a shared sense of mutuality, of interdependence, was I think the language you used, Jeff. Um, I think of being less preoccupied with ourselves and more aware of Earth time. Um, and tuned into that. I think about recognizing and acknowledging the divine in one another, and getting the glimpses of the divine from one another's traditions and our own. Um, and that divine, that transcendence, that glimpse of beauty, that glimpse of a sense of beyond what we can see and feel and touch tactilely only. I also look to that as part of the future of the kind of change that's possible.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for this very rich and deep conversation, exploring these themes of hope, solidarity, gratitude, interdependence um, in the context of the coronavirus. And um, I'll leave it there. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.